Welcome to another episode of the Know Your Compliance podcast. And today is December 19th as we shoot this. This will be released on January 1st, which is the perfect time to be doing a year-end wrap up and a look forward for 2025. So I am excited to bring my co-founder and CTO of Really Trusted back to the podcast for a second appearance. Daniel, welcome back to the show.
Hey, it's good to be back.
So, this is the time of year when we kind of look back and reflect on everything that's happened over the last 12 months and then pause, appreciate that, and then look forward to what 2025 holds. And I thought it'd be useful to have that conversation as part of our podcast, only to help frame two things. Frame mostly how quickly the sector has changed, in fact, over the last 12 months, which ties into kind of how I expect and what I think is reasonable to expect 2025 to be, which should be a bunch of hills and valleys that we can't possibly predict at this point in time. So with that as a prelude, point to me, if you wouldn't mind, walk me through 2024's big changes from the AML FINTRAC side of things. What did you see in the world as happening and in the lay of the land?
I think the biggest change was when FINTRAC managed to successfully convey to the real estate industry that our old approach to risk assessment in that sector was not working.
That's an interesting way of phrasing it. I remember that specific. I'd have to look at a calendar to make sure, but I think I know the exact date that became crystallized. Do you remember that date? The exact date?
I don't remember the exact date, but I do remember it well. We ended up with a webinar with over 1,000 registrants from people saying, "What do we do now?"
Yeah. So just to give you to put the context behind this, January 18th of 2024, CREA launched, the Canadian Real Estate Association launched a new version of their identification record template form. And that's something that, look, CREA has been publishing an ID record as part of their forms through the form software for the industry for many years. This was a pretty wholesale change. And as you quite rightly say, the risk assessment was a sharp right turn from what they had previously been describing as a risk assessment. Do you want to, our listeners to this podcast will probably understand the nuance of that, but give people the 2-minute overview of that if you could.
Yeah. So, I think the first thing to remind everybody of is that CREA has been publishing these forms for years, and they do it with the intention of providing tools to help brokerages successfully implement the policies that they need to implement.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of misconceptions about them, like, oh, these forms have been approved by FINTRAC. No, they have not. Or, oh, if I just fill out the form, then I have met obligations. No, absolutely not. And what happened when the new forms came out is people started looking at the risk assessment question and they're like, this doesn't make any sense to me. And I mean that on multiple levels. It didn't make sense to them in the context of some of the questions seem odd or impossible to answer, just in day-to-day operational reality. Yeah. But it was also odd in the sense that it all of a sudden didn't line up with their brokerage's policies. And that's when there were questions.
Yeah. There was a ton of questions coming out of that. And I mean, I think you've quite succinctly hit on something that I think, and I would suggest to you, continues to plague the industry, honestly, which is there's actually just a lack of understanding. And, actually, our listeners on this podcast are probably through this already. So they're going to think this is a step backwards or might be a little too basic. But, within the real estate sector, there still is this perception that if I fill in the form, I'm good. As recently as yesterday, quite literally yesterday, I was on a call with a managing broker who said, well, as long as I'm ticking the right boxes here, I just don't see how I get in trouble with FINTRAC. And that's that's what we're seeing still. speaking of that webinar where about 750 people ended up showing up, that was the question that we were trying our darndest to address in as way as we could, which is, look, Korea has published a different way for you to assess the level of risk in the transaction that you're required to be doing. For context, Really Trusted had published a different approach to Korea's approach about 3.5, 4 years prior. Maybe 3 years prior. I don't know exactly. So we had already considered the risk assessment part of things and had what we thought and continue to think, honestly, is a really good answer to that question. And actually, if I could put a pin in that for a second, as of the beginning of this week, it was proven to be an effective method because our forms have now been through a FINTRAC examination. Our approach has been through a FINTRAC examination, and the FINTRAC examiner was quite happy with it. So, what we've always believed has held true to the point where people actually want it. But anyhow, my point on this is the nice thing about that change that Korea pushed out was that it caused brokerages everywhere to have to possibly start to grapple with the question that we think they should have been grappling with for many years, which was, how are your agents determining the level of risk in the transaction that they're contemplating?
Well, and the great thing there was that it eliminated this long-standing pushback that we would have.
True.
When we'd say to brokerages, hey, we have these forms that we think you might want to use. And they'd go, yeah, but now I have to do all this extra work.
Yeah.
And we said to them, no, you're not understanding. It's not that now you have to do extra work. It's that you're not currently doing work that you are required to do.
That you should already be doing. Totally. Okay, so I think, that was January. If we move forward, I think it was in February. I didn't have a chance to check my notes on this, but I think it was February. We saw FINTRAC publish the Russia sanctions stuff. So that was a sector-wide change. Well, actually, that was an AML sector-wide change. Realistically, actually, I would say, for the most part, that was kind of a blip. Not a whole lot on our side of things. Anyhow, not a lot had to change. We had started treating source of funds or Russian source of funds as a elevated risk approximately a year, maybe a year and a half before that. So from a operational point of view, nothing had to change. There was some policy work we had to do for our brokerages who engage us on the FINTRAC Express side, but realistically wasn't a substantial change, I think, beyond that. I guess we did a quick training on it as well, but effectively that was pretty small blip. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, it was in our universe, and we come back to this a few times. Like, we live in the universe of brokerages that are staying on top of their compliance programs.
Fair, yeah.
And that Russian transactions were one more step in our watch list screening process. But let's not forget that Global Affairs Canada is still to some extent trying to figure out how to get people to actually use the sanctions list.
Yes, well, that's a fair point. Fair call out. Okay. And this is you've said the word. Let's go to it. That was the kind of the mid. That was probably the biggest mid-year change in the world of in our world, the sanctions evasion stuff. So walk us through kind of what that is and what that looked like, if you could.
I mean, one of the things that brokerages are expected, well, not just brokerages, and we keep forgetting about our mortgage brokers, and there's all the other FINTRAC.
Oh, let's take a step back on this. Sanctions isn't just an AML responsibility. Let's be very clear about that, actually.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, in fact, it's every Canadian.
Yeah.
Most people don't realize this. And
hold on, before we go down this path, let's define what this is so that people make sure we're following the conversation here.
So the concern, of course, after sanctions got imposed on Russia is that the next thing Russia does with that is figure out how to get around those sanctions, because it's rather inconvenient when you're unable to trade.
Yeah.
So there's now a requirement that people be able to sorry, is the background?
It's a little bit, but that's, I think our people will accept that. You've got a Christmas tree in the back as well, so it's very Christmassy, and that's the nature of it, I think,
Yeah.
It's oh, that's even more Christmassy. I love it. I love it.
There we are.
All right.
Okay. We can get. So there's a requirement now to be in a position to detect situations where evasion of the sanctions is taking place, where, maybe there's some kind of nominee, some kind of, the person that you're doing business with is not actually who you think you're doing business with. And, there was always a requirement for people to figure out who beneficial owners were in transactions and all of that. But this is yet another reason and an example of a case where it becomes very important for people to have that understanding of beneficial ownership, because that's the only way that they can detect any attempts to evade the sanctions.
Yeah, I think, I want to really, so just to really kind of get down to the brass tacks of it, Global Affairs Canada, because I don't think we've defined it yet. Global Affairs Canada publishes a handful of lists. Forgive me because I don't remember. I think it's 5 or 6 of them, but it's well documented in our policy and procedure manuals, so I can go pull that up in a FINTRAC examination. In fact, I did the other day. But for the purposes of today's podcast, Canadians everywhere have an obligation when working with somebody to ensure that people who are on those sanctions, they are not working with people who are on those sanctions lists. The big change in June was the obligation to prove and to be able to document what you had done to meet that obligation. And by putting FINTRAC in as a enforcement agency for Global Affairs Canada's lists is probably the best way I can put it. They put some teeth to this. Global Affairs Canada for a long time has felt, probably quite rightly, that the sanctions lists are underutilized or just ignored. So, what was interesting about this one to me, and I've kind of hinted at it already, and I just want to get right out there and say it clearly, is that this was not a new obligation. And I think, I'm on a bunch of different Facebook groups and with generally with real estate folks, just based on my background. And there was many chats I saw about how dare they make us enforcers of the law? How dare they continue to make us more and more like police officers? I'm just a real estate agent, shouldn't have to do all this stuff. And on this one, I kind of had to chuckle because this was not a new obligation. And the sad part was that people were so convinced that it was, that it highlights for me that they were way offside of their legal obligations prior to. And just to really be clear on it, that's a criminal code offense when you work with somebody who's on a sanctions list. Forget the FINTRAC part of this whole thing. Criminal code offense, like that's just anyhow. Yeah. So, and this was actually an interesting one to me because we had, prior to the FINTRAC the FINTRAC publication on it, in fact, months before, had already virtually solved this issue. Again, other than the training our sector people side of things, we had already incorporated all the tools into the operational processes, is how I would best phrase that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and you touched on something else there that is also become really apparent. And again, it's this like growing awareness. That conversation about how dare they expect me to do all of these things. Often the next thing they'll say is, I'm not a trained law enforcement agent. I don't have any knowledge about how to do any of this stuff.
Yeah.
And turns out one of the other obligations is that you have sufficient training.
Well, there is that as well, Yeah. So let's fast forward. In the interest of not lingering too long on any one topic, let's fast forward to October, which was the other big change. And this is probably the biggest change on the FINTRAC side of the world that we saw this year.
Yeah.
Give me a definition. What happened?
Well, so for our little part of the universe, it was entirely about mortgage brokers, although there were actually a few other sectors as well. The armored car companies.
Yeah.
But there are a whole other parts of the Canadian economy that the government has decided are now important stakeholders in the process of Canadian society being able to detect and prevent money laundering.
Yeah.
And I'm wording it that way because it's a slightly different framing than people normally go with.
I might tweak it just a little bit.
Yeah.
Which is the Canadian government has moved in this direction, partially perhaps you might say, and this might sound cynical, though it's not intended as such, because there's a mutual evaluation happening in 2025 of our AML program, of the Canadian AML program, or of FINTRAC, to put a really sharp pin on it.
And we don't really want that term snowwashing to continue to become too popular, right? Like,
yes, yeah. So, and I guess I just wanted to kind of like weave that in because it's part of 2025, and I want to come back to that in a second, but also to realize that, you know, this isn't, none of this is driven entirely by the government in power or the, you know, bureaucratic overreach or regulatory creep or any of these other things. And look, there might be some of that exists, but I generally don't think that's the case here. It seems pretty apparent to me, at least, that there was a hole in our compliance posture as a country. Sorry, with respect to anti-money laundering compliance.
Yeah.
So just we've kind of gone down the path we haven't defined. Mortgage entities are the ones that kind of we saw the most noise on, the most challenges with, and the most requirement for help out there, I think, is how I could best put that. Just to like kind of provide some insight, the cool thing about the mortgage sector is that it's actually very similar and closely tied to the real estate sector. And that's a sector we've spent all of our existence really effectively working in. So we were somewhat uniquely positioned to be able to offer a pretty easy, I hope, and I think we're seeing evidence that it is our solution to these new requirements that mortgage entities everywhere across the country were faced with. So just to put it in like a really quick sentence, if you haven't heard, mortgage entities across Canada are now reporting entities and have all of the same obligations as every other reporting entity, from appointment of compliance officer straight on through to doing an effectiveness review of the FINTRAC program you've put in place. And everything in between. And there's a lot in between, by the way. I just dotted the most important part, perhaps. But anyhow, that's where I think we've spent a lot of the fall, at least as a company, has been working through the education, training, operationalization, systematization of providing compliance programs to a new sector, in this case, the mortgage sector. And I think what I would say is that our learnings have been that it's very challenging, and it's challenging in the mortgage sector for the same reasons it's challenging in the real estate sector, which is by and large, these are small businesses with limited profits, and therefore not a huge ability to invest in an anti-money laundering compliance program, though having a new obligation to do so, whether they like it or not, is the.
You know, I agree with you, and that's all true. But there's another aspect that is especially prevalent in the real estate industry that is also true in the mortgage industry, and that's the sales imperative. That's the industry structure.
Yeah, fair point.
Right? The prevalence of independent contractors, the fact that whoever's bringing in the deal flow, and they can bring in that deal flow wherever they want.
Yeah.
There's real pushback to anything that is perceived as having the potential of getting in the way of doing business.
Adding work. That salesperson. Work. And look, I've been a realtor for 15 years. I fully get, maybe it's 14, I don't know. Anyhow, I fully appreciate that your income as a mortgage person or real estate agent is based on getting this deal done, this and the next, as many as you can. And yet there's this obligation now to be doing the assessment of risk, monitoring of risk, and so on and so on and so on. And let's be clear, there's other obligations I'm just going to kind of gloss over for the purposes of not doing a full training session.
I want to go to a question that we heard in the FINTRAC exam today. That question was, have you filed any suspicious transaction reports? And the reason I want to bring up that question is because it was absolutely not a bad thing when the answer was yes. It was a good thing.
Yeah, I think it's, I'm glad you raised that point. I hadn't thought about that part of things, but one of the things we hear frequently when we're doing consults with brokerages, generally not brokerages after they've hired us, but prior to hiring us, is, oh, no, we don't have any high risk clients. No, it's just not something we do. We only deal with people we know really, really well. And there's just so much wrong in that statement. And like, look, that's a statement that I've heard countless times, but like every part of that sentence, let's parse it for a second. We only deal with high risk clients. Well, first of all, that's probably because you've poorly defined your risk.
Low risk.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So we only deal with low risk clients. Yeah, sorry, you're right. It's probably because you've poorly defined your risk in your documentation, because you should have some level of clients that are being elevated to a high risk position.
By the way, another question he had was, do you have any high risk clients?
Right, exactly. And then secondly, if just because they're high risk doesn't mean you're going to be filing an STR, and that's a common misconception that happens at that same juncture in time. And then the third part of that sentence to break out is, we only deal with people we know. Well, guess what? People you know might also be high risk clients. So they're like, that whole sentence just falls apart on its face really quickly. And so I'm glad you mentioned it, and you're right. You've drawn in, I think, the last part of our 2024 look back that I really wanted to touch on, which to me was, for our company, it happened this week, and it was probably the best way I can put it. It's the culmination of what we've been working for many years. In fact, was the opportunity to sit through and work with a real estate brokerage through a FINTRAC examination. And you've pulled out something that I think was really helpful. What else did you hear during that FINTRAC examination that is worth kind of sharing with our audience, and that you think might be helpful for them to understand, I guess?
The notion of controls, the reason we were there was in the context of a brokerage that had significant gaps in the past. And that's, of course, why they started working with us, because they recognized, hey, like, we need to get our house in order on this.
Yeah.
And what FINTRAC is looking for is to make sure that you have controls in place, and that for the risks that they've identified, and they've done a lot of work to kind of clarify what the controls need to be. Let's not forget the legislation starts out pretty vague and broad, and that's intentional. That's because this is an ever-evolving world, and there's a small number of things that we've pointed out that have changed in the last year. There's a whole bunch of other more minor nuances that have just kind of gotten rolled into our operations and procedures and whatnot.
Yeah.
And FINTRAC absolutely expects you to put the work into staying on top of that, to looking at everything they're publishing, everything that's going on, and constantly adjusting your risk posture accordingly. So, having us in the room and saying, hey, look, these are the things that we're doing to stay on top of that, was an important part of that conversation. And for maybe every single real estate brokerage out there, I can think of maybe one or two, but is basically impossible for people to do on their own.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, it's a conversation I had after with the compliance officer from that brokerage, where she said, look, like, we're big enough. We have the resources to do some of this ourselves, but having you in that room was still really important for us, because it's just too much for us. And this is a large enough brokerage that they've got, 2 people in charge of their compliance program, effectively, for lack of a better way of describing it. and they very much saw, in fact, was very appreciative of the of us being in the room and helping them through that. You get into the truly small, the under 10, the 20s, the 30 agents, the 40 agents, anything under, I don't know, 200. I don't know. I actually don't know how a compliance officer could stay on top of all of the stuff and the both the changes, but also the training piece for their people, the ongoing monitoring of it. Like there is effectively almost a full-time job if you really are doing this properly, almost regardless of your size, I guess is the best way I can put it. And that just doesn't scale well without assistance. And that's kind of what I think, what I would suggest to folks, that and where we've found this niche is that we're able to provide scaled support for the size of brokerage, almost regardless of the size of brokerage, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So,
well, and we're also in a position because of that expertise to. It's you touched on overreach before. And you see this issue in any kind of auditing, whether it's FINTRAC, whether it's BCFSA, whatever we're talking about. But occasionally you'll get an auditor that has a particular interpretation of things that might go directly against published guidance, or like there's various versions of that story.
Yeah.
And so having the ability to confidently push back appropriately, respectfully.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. No, that's a good point. That's actually a super valuable point, and it and it was true on Monday as well. Okay, so I think we've done a pretty deep dive into 2024, and I think that was most of what I wanted to talk about today. I just want to turn quickly our attention to what's next. What's 2025 look like? And I think I'm going to summarize it with kind of the following thing. If you had asked me that question December 19th of 2023, I could not have predicted almost all of the things we've talked about today. The only one I could have predicted, because we knew it was coming, was the mortgage or the expansion of FINTRAC regulatory scope around the mortgage entities and armored cars and all the rest. Everything else came as, I don't want to say a surprise, because that makes it sound like we just weren't expecting it, but we could not have told you when or what it would have been, other than to say things will change. So I think certainly 2025, it is fair to say things will change.
Preparedness meets opportunity. And, our opportunity is about making people's lives better and easier and helping effective compliance programs continue to be in place as the world changes. And the world really changed a lot this year. And it was fortunate for us. It was in the way that we've been preparing for the last 6+ years.
Yeah. I would add, just because it ties into where I think we're going to see some sector stuff. The FATFA mutual evaluation is 2025, and look, FINTRAC's already started to take a risk-based approach to doing that, I think would be the best way I can put that. We saw them publish. There was the legal professionals update they published a couple months back now, where, best as I can tell, the reason, I mean, look, there was some good stuff in there from an indicators of risk and all the rest, but I think it was an attempt at FINTRAC to pre-deal with a risk that they know exists that they have not been able to solve, which is that legal professionals are not captured by as a reporting entity. And I'm quite confident that we'll see that called out in the FATFA mutual evaluation. And by publishing the circular on it, it gives them a bit of a, well, we are aware of the risk. We have controlled it as best as we can, because FINTRAC operates in a risk-based approach as well. And so I suspect the mutual evaluation will call that out. I think it'd be hard-pressed to not see them call that out. They did last time too. And I think this was amongst other, I think there was great value in the information published, but I think it also gives them an answer to that question. So I think I'll be looking for, and I guess where I'm going with that is, I'll be looking for FINTRAC to do similar things towards risks that they either know exist or can easily see exist. And so we're seeing a focus. I couldn't find the stat, but I know that they are focused on doing examinations within the real estate and MSB sectors is where they see a lot of the risk in the Canadian landscape. And so most of their examinations, I think it was ended up being 50% of their examinations were going to be within those two reporting sectors, was the stat I'd heard. And I'm making up the stat, but I think it's something like that. So
I know they have very aggressive targets in terms of how many people they intend to audit. It is considerably more likely than it used to be.
Yeah. Well, and they've also developed new tools to do that. Those aren't all just FINTRAC examinations in office that take multiple days. They've got these e-cars that we've seen a handful of our brokerages fill out and complete and work through. They've got a number of other tools at their disposal now so that they can do a quicker overview of the landscape, and then they can do, again, risk-based approach. They can do a deeper dive on the ones where they're most concerned after some sort of initial screening to know, which is probably a really useful thing, I think.
Yeah, a risk-based approach. Imagine that.
Imagine that. Yeah.
You touched on the lawyer thing, and we'll see. I think this is fairly slow moving. There's all the charter rights issues that come around lawyers, and that's why we're in this weird situation that we're in, where they appear to be this big gap in our regulatory regime.
Yep.
But what we are seeing as a consequence of that is more requirements on all the other sectors that are part of the regime. And what I mean by that is, we've had brokerages that have said things to us like, oh, well, it came from a lawyer. It must be good. And we'll see what happens with that. I think that's an evolving thing, but I would say that if you look at our risk assessment process, for example, looking at the transaction and asking if there are steps, if there are intermediaries that could be obscuring the source of funds, and a lawyer might be one of them, that's a risk that other sectors are expected to be dealing with. So anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, it's a good point. Okay. Well, so I think if I were to summarize my look forward for 2025, expect change. Expect more things to continue to change, and expect that you, as a compliance officer at a brokerage anywhere, mortgage or real estate, or any other sector for that matter, have an obligation to stay on top of it and to turn the ship in such a way that you're managing the risks that are newly identified, and or managing the direction that might give people different insights into where you might find risk, in fact. So, yeah. All right. Well, Daniel, thanks very much for the chat. I will let you get back to the beautiful snow-covered landscape there, which is just perfect for the season.
Yeah,
To all of our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in to another episode. I hope you've enjoyed this look back and the thoughts that we shared with around the challenges within the sector. Have a wonderful, happy holidays. I hope you've had actually, by the time this is released, I hope you've had a wonderful, happy holidays. And we look forward to connecting with you in 2025 for all of your anti-money laundering compliance needs. Have a wonderful, happy New Year. Yeah.
And you know what? The first episode of the podcast, we focused on gratitude. Let's add a little bit of gratitude to this one as well. I'm grateful for the amazing 2024 we had, and I know 2025 is going to be at least as exciting. So.
I am truly grateful, and I kind of didn't say it eloquently enough. I am truly grateful for the opportunity to serve in the sectors we do. I'm the amount of energy and work that the people who we're engaged with are putting into their compliance programs and are wanting to put into their compliance programs and are genuinely wanting to do it properly. I'm always blown away by that, and I'm very thankful for the opportunity to help them. So thank you to you, our listeners, and to those who have engaged us. Have a wonderful day. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Know Your Compliance podcast. If you'd like more information about our guests, have a story idea, or want to be a guest, please reach out to hello@kycpodcast.com. If you want to discuss your anti-money laundering compliance needs with a member of the Really Trusted team, go to www.reallytrusted.com/consult.